Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about grains, in particular, refined grains, and whether they are nutritious, if they increase the risk of overweight and obesity, what the research shows, and what the guidance says. Refined grains have long been labeled as something to limit or avoid. However, there is a new review of existing research that we are going to discuss today. I have two expert guests today, Dale Hayes and Dr. Glenn Gazer. Dale Hayes is a registered dietitian and award-winning child nutrition expert, author, and educator who has dedicated decades to making school environments healthy for students and staff. She's a sought-after speaker all across the United States. She's co-authored and lead-authored many important professional position and practice papers regarding child nutrition. In recognition of her professional and volunteer leadership, Dale has received numerous honors, including the Silver Fame Award from the National School Nutrition Association, a Medallion Award from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, as well as delivering the prestigious Lena Francis Cooper Memorial Lecture at FNCE, the Food and Nutrition Conference and Expo. Glenn Gazer is a professor in the College of Health Solutions at Arizona State University and has had prior academic appointments at the University of Virginia and UCLA. Professor Gazer's research focuses on the effects of exercise and diet on cardiovascular fitness and health, and his work has been published in scientific journals, trade publications, newsletters, and internet sites. He's made significant contributions to the literature on the science of grains and health. He's given more than 300 invited regional, national, and international presentations to a variety of professional, business, and lay audiences. He's had a number of national television and radio appearances as well, and he also participated in an expert scientific panel to address the role of refined grains in health, which led to the 2020 paper, Do Refined Grains Have a Place in a Healthy Dietary Pattern? Perspectives from an Expert Panel Consensus Meeting, which led to this podcast episode and our conversation today. Dr. Gazer was actually on the podcast back on episode 120, talking about refined grains and diabetes, specifically the research on the relationship between refined grains intake and the risk of type 2 diabetes. By the way, that episode is eligible for one free continuing education unit for dietitians, dietechnicians, and diabetes educators. So that was a long introduction, but welcome to the show, Dale and Glenn.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Now, this episode is not sponsored, but I'm excited to share that our friends at the Grain Foods Foundation have provided resources and support to submit this episode for one free continuing education unit for dietitians, dietechnicians, and diabetes educators. So keep an eye out for that to be added to my CEU library at soundbitesrd.com. Now, before we jump into our topic, I always like to hear from my guests. I would love for each of you to share a little bit more about yourselves and your backgrounds, and of course, any disclosures that you should note, and perhaps what led you to study or focus on nutrition, and in particular, grain foods. So let's start with Dr. Gazer.
All right. So my background scientifically is in the area of exercise science. I got my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in 1978. Focusing in exercise physiology and really the study of metabolic and cardiovascular adaptations to exercise. So if you fast forward from there to the early mid-90s, I began to have a keen interest on the issue of obesity. As everyone well knows, obesity prevalence has increased dramatically over the last several decades. And it was during that time from about the late 70s, early 80s, just about the time I got my PhD and started in academia, the obesity prevalence started to skyrocket. So that interested me, particularly from the standpoint of energy balance and exercise. So the more I researched it, I found that there was a lot of misperceptions about obesity, what causes it, and the health risks and so forth. And wrote a book that was published first in 1996 and updated in 2002 called Big Fat Lies. And in the book, I did some research on the contribution of nutrition to a healthy lifestyle. I used what was at the time the current dietary recommendations, the food guide pyramid. And at the base of the food guide pyramid was the grain foods. And the recommendation was basically to consume grains, both whole and refined. And so my dietary recommendations in that book mainly focused on healthy diet and the role grains could play in a healthy diet. And one of my presentations that I gave about that time in the audience was Judy Adams, who at the time was the president of the Wheat Foods Council and later became president of the Grain Foods Foundation. And she asked me if I'd be willing to write a book with a dietitian, Karen Cortina, on this topic. And so that's how I really got started in this. She liked the message that I had to say about big fat lies in the 1990s. It was really more of an expose on the whole obesity issue. One thing led to another. So for the last 20 some odd years, I've been performing a mix of both exercise and diet-related studies that led me to my current role with the Grain Foods Foundation, Scientific Advisory Board member, and focusing specifically on the impact of grains in health.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Dale, you are so well renowned in the dietitian world. You are the school nutrition guru for sure. What can you tell us about your career, your interest in nutrition and grain foods specifically? And I know Dr. Gazer is going to speak a lot to the research and you can speak a lot to the application in child nutrition, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Melissa. First of all, I think I might have been in that same audience with Judy Adams, so that my path with Glenn, our paths crossed many years ago, and really around that issue of sort of obesity and health. And then in terms of grains, I don't have any disclosures. I was part of the consensus panel that worked on this paper, but no other disclosures or conflicts of interest. Mm-hmm. I love to eat grains, whole grains, refined grains, all those kinds of things I think are an important part of a delicious eating style. Mm-hmm. In terms of children at school, my issues really are twofold. Number one is that we figure out how to get the most nutritious, best food into children via school meals. And certainly over the pandemic, we've seen that meals that come from schools are incredibly vital for somewhere, upwards of 30 million children a day who rely on meals that come at school or through schools to provide nutrition for them. So number one is, what's the best way that we can get the nutrients that children need, both to grow strong, but also to do well in school? How do we get those nutrients into kids? And I always rely on the saying is it's only nutrition when they eat it. Having it on a menu or saying we're serving this today is immaterial if it's not actually eaten by children. Mm-hmm. The second piece of feeding children in schools that's really become very important to me is the whole issue of food waste. Mm. Obviously, these two things are related, but dietitians in general, I think, have become really concerned about and focused on how do we reduce food waste all the way from food service to home, but particularly in schools. How do we make certain that the food that's planned and prepared and served is actually going into children and not into trash cans? Mm. Food waste has become obviously a big issue. And I think when we talk about grains or we talk about really eliminating any kinds of foods, that often leads to food waste. So it's that intersection of nutrition for kids, feeding them well, and doing whatever we can to reduce food waste across all sectors in our country.
Thank you. Yes. And of course, we are going to talk about shortfall nutrients in a little bit. But we hear about carbs, grains, refined grains, that they're bad for us. Whole grains are good for us. Maybe, maybe not. But before we really dig into the research and the consensus statement, let's take a step back and discuss what are refined grains and how they've been studied, because I think this is really key to bringing us full circle to understand, where things are today. So Maybe a little bit of refined grains 101. What are quote unquote refined grains and how are they different from whole grains? And we hear about enriched and fortified. So I want to talk about those as well, what the difference is. So Glenn, maybe you're the best person to kind of start addressing that question.
The easiest way to say this is that refined grains have been processed in such a way that a lot of the nutrients have been removed in that milling or processing of the grains. So if you compare a whole grain with a refined grain, generally you have less dietary fiber and you've got lower amounts of some of the important nutrients, the micronutrients that are present in the whole grains. And this refining process can occur to varying extents so that you can have a great deal of processing or not so much. So the bottom line is that most of the grains that we actually consume here in the United States are refined grains. But it's also important to note that these refined grains are also probably at least 95% maybe of the refined grains we consume are enriched or fortified. In other words, some of the nutrients, the goodies, if you will, that were removed in the processing are added back in to levels that are as high as they were, sometimes even more than they were in the original state. So it's important to note that the refined grains are milled and processed to the point where they lose some of their nutritional value, but a lot of the goodies, particularly shortfall nutrients that are important in the American diet, are added back in. So that's probably the easiest way to explain this. Another important distinction is that whole grains are almost invariably, when you look at them and how they're defined, generally associated with what you might call good, healthy foods, whereas the refined grains, their definitions vary tremendously to include not only your staple grain foods like breads and cereals and pasta, but they also include a lot of indulgent foods that are like grain-based desserts, cookies, cakes, pies, pastries, and the like. So that's where a lot of the problem comes in, is that we kind of have this binary system of defining grains as either whole or refined, and whole grains are the good grains and refined are bad. Mm-hmm. At least that's the general consensus, that refined are bad. And it's largely because they're just lumped in this big pot of both staple and indulgent grain foods that obviously would have different qualities in terms of their nutritional value.
Right. And when you say lumped in, that's when we're going to get into a little bit later about how grains have been studied. Lumped in with regard to research and lumped in with regard to guidance, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. For example, another problem in terms of the research is that much of the dietary information comes out every 5 years from the dietary guidelines, and they rely on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's report to issue these guidelines, and we're currently operating on the most recent 2020 guidelines. Generally, the Scientific Advisory Committee relies heavily on what is called dietary pattern research, and a lot of the refined grains that are studied are included in a dietary pattern typically referred to as a Western or an imprudent dietary pattern that contains not only refined grains, staple and indulgent grain foods, but also include things like red and processed meat, French fries, sugar-sweetened beverages, and so forth. So you have this kind of dietary pattern that has a lot of what you might call unhealthy foods. And refined grains are lumped in there. So if you find that an unhealthy dietary pattern is associated with increased risk of, let's say, heart disease or diabetes, you have to ask the question, what part of that dietary pattern is really the problem? Is it the refined grains? Is it the indulgent grains, the desserts and so forth? Is it staple grains, or is it maybe processed meat? Is it the French fries? Is it sugar-sweetened beverages and so forth? High-fat dairy foods are oftentimes included in those definitions. So that is a real problem in terms of research. And the dietary guidelines, at least for the last 2 or 3 cycles from like 2010, 15, and 20, have relied heavily on dietary pattern research without actually looking at the independent effects, separate effects of both the staple and indulgent grain foods by themselves. And therein lies a real problem. So you have problems in research and problems in the interpretation of that research.
Right. I mean, even as a dietitian, I would say I think most people would be surprised to learn that refined grains research includes, you mentioned staple grains and indulgent grains, that it lumps them together. I mean, white bread and white rice versus a donut. I mean, I think, we can all clearly see the difference there. So I think that is really surprising. And, we talked about this back in podcast episode 120 with regard to refined grains and diabetes. So let me circle back a little bit, and maybe, Dale, this is a good question for you to answer. When it comes to enriched or fortified grains, Glenn, you mentioned that, some of the nutrients are lost in that quote unquote processing, which, processed is another sort of red flag word that, we hear these days. So what are the nutrients that would be enriched or fortified in a refined grain? And what's the fiber situation there?
Thank you, Melissa. I would like to just piggyback on something that Glenn just said that I think is really important as we have this conversation and think about that term staple grains versus indulgent grains. Because one of the things that's come up a lot in school meal programs is that there are several staple grain products that are refined. White rice in many Asian cuisines, tortillas, flour tortillas made from white flour in a lot of Central American and Mexican cuisines, and pasta even, where those are fundamental to how families eat and to cultural eating patterns. So to introduce or to say those are bad foods, or you should limit those and you should only have, brown rice, whole grain pasta, and, whole grain tortillas, they don't make sense for the cuisine, and the refined items are really fundamental staples. And when you talk about what nutrients are eliminated in the refining process, because that's what happens when you take off outer layers of the grain itself, we're primarily looking at micronutrients, as Glenn said. So we're looking at some minerals, some B vitamins, and, basically those are the things that might be added in to be enriched and or fortified. And those have implications for the levels. But essentially, it's adding in those micronutrients back to at least the level they were present in the original grain. It's not generally, especially if we're talking about the staples, it's not generally talking about changing caloric content. Certainly if you get into the indulgent cakes, pies, cookies, those kinds of things, then you see a calorie difference. In general, it is true that refined grains have less fiber because that fiber has been taken off in the outer portion, the bran of the grain itself. However, I think a lot of refined grains now, especially refined grain products, are either served with things that are high in fiber. For example, if you take white rice and you serve it with a variety of vegetables, maybe some legumes, you've really got the fiber that we're looking for in the overall dietary pattern, as Glenn pointed out. So mostly fortified and enriched, you're going to be adding back in nutrients that are important, but vitamins and minerals, fiber generally is not added back into a refined grain. But there are lots of ways to combine foods, to use those refined grains as a vehicle for getting in fiber from other sources.
Yeah, very good. And I've actually seen the statistic that about 2/3 of the fiber in our diets actually come from these enriched grain products. So it's not that they're devoid of fiber, but it sounds like they're not as rich in fiber as whole grains. And certainly grains are not the only source of fiber in our diets. You mentioned the vegetables and fruits, legumes, beans. So let's also talk about, we mentioned some of the enriched and the fortified grains and the shortfall nutrients. Dale, specifically when it comes to child nutrition, can you speak to what are these shortfall nutrients, or I've heard the term nutrients of concern, and how do grains help us meet those?
Yes, Melissa, that is something that we're looking at. Calcium is one of the nutrients of concern, a shortfall nutrient, and that is not present normally in whole grains in any significant amount, but it can be added to other enriched grains. after processing. Another shortfall nutrient that is of major concern is iron, particularly a concern for young women of childbearing age. And we frequently see that iron, which is a nutrient of concern for young women, is added into a fortified grain product. So again, it is minerals like calcium and iron. Also, some of the very important B vitamins, which again may not be shortfall nutrients for everybody, but are shortfall nutrients for children, are among those that are added back in. So one of the things that I sort of, to come full circle to my comments about school meals, is that if, say you're serving a brown rice product with, maybe vegetables and some sort of protein, and children don't really aren't comfortable, aren't familiar with brown rice and don't eat that, first of all, they're not getting calories. But if they had a white rice served with that that was enriched, they would have been getting some of those shortfall nutrients. So again, it's that they're not getting the nutrients by not eating the food, but then also we get to the food waste question, and that food gets thrown away.
Thank you. So before we jump into the consensus statement and the findings there, I wanted to talk just a little bit about what the 2020-2025 dietary guidelines have to say about grains, because there's the make half your grains whole phrase that I'd like to talked about that on the show before, but also would love to hear from both of you, some of the key takeaways that are already in the dietary guidelines before we kind of take it to a more nuanced level with regard to the consensus statement. Glenn, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. The 2020 guidelines, if you take a look at them carefully with regard to the recommendations for grains, they pretty much carry forward from the 2015 guidelines with regard to recommendations. Again, it's make half your grains whole. So there are some obvious reasons for that. For example, if you look at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data that the guidelines rely heavily on, the average American consumes less than one serving a day of whole grains. So the recommendation for someone, let's say, consuming 2,000 calories a day, which is usually what they like to use as a kind of a reference point, that would mean about 3 servings a day of whole grains. The average American gets less than 1. So we are a far way away from meeting recommendations. On the other hand, the number of servings that the average American consumes with regard to refined grains, and again, it varies depending upon age, sex, race, ethnicity, typically is about 5 to 7 servings a day. So we consume far more refined grains than we do whole grains. And that's one of the reasons why actually most of our dietary fiber, certainly cereal fiber, comes from refined grains, because refined grains are not totally devoid of fiber, but we consume a lot of them. So when you take a look at what the recommendations are, I have no qualms about the recommendation to consume more whole grains. There's a lot of epidemiological research that strongly supports whole grain consumption for reducing risk of chronic diseases. There's no question about that. I don't know that we need to make the claim that we need to replace refined grains with whole grains. And the reason for that is because the literature that has been published on this doesn't show much in the way of any strong relationship between refined grain intake, even up to 5, 6, 7 servings a day, and increased risk of a lot of chronic diseases. So the guidelines might be better off just saying, hey, try to focus on consuming more whole grains without any kind of specific recommendation for reducing refined grain or enriched grain intake.
Thank you. Yeah. And Dale, we were talking about the enriched and fortified, and believe it was back in the late 90s that the folic acid fortification of enriched grains became a requirement. It was shortly after that I became a supermarket dietitian. So I know that change is something that most people are probably familiar with, and that fortification became one of the top 10 public health achievements of the first decade of the 21st century. So it's pretty important to look at the fortification and enrichment of these sort of staple grains.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Melissa. I think that's one of the things that we've sort of taken for granted was the folic acid fortification. And also that has had a substantial public health benefit in terms of reducing certain kinds of birth defects and that sort of thing. So those things that are added back in are important to overall public health. I wanted to also mention that industry has been playing an important role here in terms of products that are available, not just products, but from the agricultural standpoint, grains. So there's something now called white whole wheat. There are actually brand names for different flour companies have different brand names for it. But essentially, white whole wheat is a whole grain, so you don't take off the bran. So you have the fiber there, and you have some of those other benefits of a whole grain, but its appearance is different. And for a lot of people, I remember when my children were growing up, and the difference between white bread and whole wheat bread or whole grain bread, was that it had seeds in it, and one of them didn't want seeds in their bread. So appearance is important, and the white whole wheat has become really common on grocery store shelves and that sort of thing. But the other thing that's happened in terms of not just processed or refined grains, but actual food products is that a lot of manufacturers have worked to make a combination of let's just take a biscuit, for example, that might be served in school breakfast programs, which are incredibly important. And there are companies who have worked really hard to get the amount of whole grain in that biscuit to be at a level that we can call whole grain rich. So 51% of the grains in it are whole grains, which I see as a real benefit for getting some more of those whole grains in, as Glenn pointed out, how few servings most Americans eat, but putting it into a product that has a lot of acceptability and is something that's really important, like school breakfast. So I think what we need to realize is that this isn't a black and white issue, if you will. This isn't a, again, back to whole grains are good and refined grains are not good, is that there's a spectrum, not only as we've said in terms of what the staple and the indulgent are, but there's also a spectrum in terms of the level of whole grains that might be in a loaf of bread or might be in a biscuit or might be in a cereal. And that I believe that the food industry has really, at least from the products I'm most familiar with in school, has really stepped up and created some products that have a really good acceptability, but have some more fiber in them, the benefits of the whole grains, and then also have the level of enrichment or fortification that we're looking for.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Great example of, making the healthy choice the easier choice, or easy. Before we move on to the consensus, like I said, I've shared this before on the podcast, but even as a dietitian, the make half your grains whole was confusing to me until I started talking with experts like you, explaining the goal is not, well, we know we can't get all of our grains whole grains, so it's just a more realistic recommendation to make half your grains whole. It literally is make half your grains whole, and the other half can be refined and enriched and fortified, and that's fine. So switching gears to the consensus statement, first, I want to give a shout out to the consensus statement panel members, all very big names in the field of nutrition. We've got Yanni Papanikolaou, Joanne Slavin, Roger Clemens, Tom Brenna, Dale Hayes, of course, and Glenn Gazer, and also Victor Fulgoni. And I am just very lucky that I've been able to meet all of these experts in person. So, Glenn, maybe you can set the stage for us about why this panel came together, the purpose for reviewing all of the research and coming up with this consensus statement.
Sure. The primary impetus for it was to try to clarify a lot of the misinformation that seemed to be pervasive in the media, in the scientific communities, with regard to the role of refined grains or enriched grains in health. So we got together, it was a one-day roundtable discussion is the way it panned out. And we addressed a number of questions. One was like, okay, what is the role of whole and refined grains in terms of their contributions to providing nutrients, essential nutrients or shortfall nutrients, nutrients of interest to the American diet. Another issue was whether or not there was any significant or compelling evidence that refined grains contribute to overweight and obesity. And the reason for that is because the obesity prevalence has just skyrocketed in the last few decades, and there are a lot of individuals out there that seem to think that our consumption of refined grain foods has contributed a lot to that increased prevalence of overweight or obesity. So those are the main reasons for putting the panel together. So we all discussed the topics that I just mentioned, and then Yanni and Victor basically took that information and drafted a statement that all the other panelists looked at, provided feedback, and it went back and forth over a few months and then finally appeared in print. It was published. So that was the real focus. It was basically to try to clarify the misconceptions and misperceptions that a lot of individuals had with regard to refined grains. Because as soon as you mention that processing or refining process that gives us our refined grains, it conjures up these kind of negative connotations. Mm-hmm. I mean, processing just has a negative connotation that, everything should be eaten like just how it comes from nature, which is just absurd anyway, because all foods, even whole grains, are processed to a certain extent, because if they weren't, the only true unprocessed, take wheat, for example, one of the major grains we consume, a truly unprocessed wheat would be just going off out into the fields and getting it right off the chaff, and you're just basically consuming the wheat just without any processing whatsoever. Of course, we don't do that. So all foods are processed to a certain extent. It's just the refined foods are processed to a greater extent. We just wanted to see whether or not refined grains could contribute meaningfully to the American diet in terms of providing some essential nutrients, and what might happen if we removed those foods from the diet. And that led to some very interesting discussion.
Mm-hmm. So how many total published research studies did you review?
The article itself, the actual manuscript that was published, had about 60 papers that were included in the reference list. And a lot of these were major review articles, meta-analyses, a lot of publications straight out of the dietary guidelines and so forth. So it wasn't a comprehensive review that had hundreds of articles. We relied heavily on the major review articles that have been published primarily within the last 10 or 20 years. We focused on those. So that's what we discussed and how we arrived at our conclusions.
And of course, I will have a link to the whole consensus paper and the 11 statements in my show notes, along with other resources that I'll recap at the end. Obviously, we can't go through all 11, but maybe we can go through some of the most compelling ones that you want to share with the listeners, also addressing, what you found regarding grain foods' contributions to nutrient intake. We've talked about that a bit, but you mentioned also, Glenn, about, what happens if we eliminate grain foods from the diet? And I know, Dale, you touched on that a little bit, but I would like to hear more about that. And you also touched on overweight and obesity, Glenn. So maybe we'll start with you, Dale, some of the consensus statements that you wanted to share with us, or concepts addressing some of these points.
Actually, I'd like to focus in on the number 2 statement, which says grain foods are meaningful contributors of nutrient density to the American diet in both children and adults. And I think we've covered that these really are foods which have a nutrient impact. It's a package of nutrients, and it's not just one thing. And then it says, with particular emphasis on ready-to-eat cereals, breads, rolls, and tortillas. And I want to just highlight, put a check mark beside ready-to-eat cereals, because, again, I think that that's an area where sometimes, people lump all cereals in together with some cereals that may be indulgent, that may be higher in sugar or fat or that kind of thing. But ready-to-eat cereals are a really important contributor to nutrition for children. So children who have ready-to-eat cereal for breakfast, especially because ready-to-eat cereal is most often served with milk, so we have calcium and protein and other nutrients there. But children who eat ready-to-eat cereal in general are meeting more of those shortfall nutrients than other children. So as we're talking about, I know we've mentioned staples as in, rice and pasta and those kinds of things, but ready-to-eat cereal is a significant source of nutrition, especially for children. And many ready-to-eat cereals, even though they use refined grains, now have fiber added to them as well, or are a combination of refined and whole grains. So that was just one of the statements that I wanted to highlight.
Great. Thank you. Yes, big fan of cereals over here. Definitely a very nutrient-rich choice. Even if it is a little higher in sugar, you're still getting a lot of great nutrition and usually served with milk or yogurt. So thank you for sharing that. Glenn, what would you like to share from the statements and what you found regarding overweight and obesity?
Yeah, that was the most interesting aspect of it for me. As Dale mentioned, a lot of discussion about what might happen if you removed certain grain products, breads or ready-to-eat cereals or all grains from the diet in both adults and children, and what that might do to the consumption of some very important nutrients like folate, iron, fiber, thiamine, other B vitamins, and so forth. But those are modeling studies. In other words, kind of what if? And you ask the question. The interesting thing for me was that when you look at the data published on the relationship between refined grain intake from all grains, whether you're talking about the staple grains or even lumping in some of the indulgent grain foods in there, because most of the research that's been published doesn't distinguish between the two. They kind of lump them in all into one category. You don't find any compelling argument that would suggest that refined grain consumption is associated with increased risk of obesity. And I know this just goes against the conventional wisdom out there, but you'd be hard-pressed to find studies that show that relationship. As a matter of fact, when you take a look at the obesity prevalence, which is undoubtedly increased, no one disputes that, over the last several decades, during the same period of time that obesity prevalence has pretty much tripled in the United States, refined grain intake has really not changed all that much. And bread intake, even white bread, your bread made from enriched flour, has actually decreased. Mm-hmm. So we have this undeniable dissociation between refined grain intake or bread intake and the increased prevalence of obesity. So just looking at that, you would have to walk away from that saying, well, I guess there's nothing to see here anymore, because there is no association. And it's just striking to me, and I think other members of the panel, that these data have existed for years. It's not like something that just was published the year we put this consensus statement out. These are data that go back over the last several decades, and you'd be hard-pressed to find any compelling evidence that refined grain intake is associated with increased risk of obesity. And I think that really is something that a lot of people, both scientists as well as lay people, would be surprised to hear.
Absolutely. So with all of this in mind, it's not surprising, I guess, that the consensus statements include suggesting that the dietary guidance and future research kind of reconsiders how we talk about grains and how we study grains. And these are two distinctly different things. But I'd like to talk a little bit more as we wrap up about your insights and recommendations for both about how we talk about grains with patients, clients, the public, and also what you suggest regarding research moving forward. So maybe we'll start with you, Glenn. What would you like the research community to take away from this consensus statement?
The number one thing that I would like to have the research community acknowledge and use in moving forward in terms of research is distinguishing between the staple and indulgent grain foods. It's just unacceptable to think of grain foods as just a single category that includes everything from breads and cereals, pasta, and so forth, and also includes your indulgent snack foods, cakes, cookies, pastries, pies, and things like that. These are not the same.
Right.
And I really think that any reasonable person would have to agree that it would be important to distinguish between the staple and indulgent grain foods with regard to impact on health outcomes. I think that's very important. And very few researchers, very little of the published research has done that. So that is something that needs to be addressed in moving forward. And I think that might provide some clarification with regard to the true impact of refined grain foods on health outcomes.
Yeah, and correct me if I say this wrong, but I remember when we talked about refined grains and diabetes, not only was I enlightened to, wait, these two very different, in my mind, food groups are lumped together, but also when you're talking about the research not showing an association between refined grains and obesity, your caveat was, well, we don't know, we haven't studied it, but it would kind of make sense that if we separated those two food groups, in my mind, out separately, and the indulgent grains were not involved with the research, what we might see regarding the link between refined staple grains and obesity or diabetes.
Yes, you actually may find something entirely different than what is currently out there. Right now, there's really no evidence to suggest that the refined grain intake, even refined grains that include indulgent grain foods, are associated with diabetes risk. So, I mean, even if you look at the diabetes website, the American Diabetes website, they will indicate that even sugar consumption is not linked to diabetes risk. And sugar is a major component of our indulgent grain foods. So like donuts and cookies and pastries and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that is something that needs to be, I think, considered in moving forward. And we've been talking about mostly these cohort studies, epidemiological studies that look at associations. But even when you look at the randomized control trials, you find something even more puzzling, because if whole grains are generally assumed to be far superior to refined grains in terms of their health properties, and the recommendation to consume more whole grains and limit our consumption of refined grains, you would expect that in randomized control trials, a much more of a gold standard type of research design than your observational cohort studies, you don't find that whole grains have a superiority to refined grains in terms of health outcomes. So you might think, well, refined grains are associated with the increased risk of diabetes or increased risk of heart disease. I mean, those are common perceptions. Therefore, if we had people consume more whole grains and less refined grains, their blood pressures would be better, their blood lipids would be better, they would lose more weight, and so forth. The randomized control trials do not show that. So this is a major conundrum we still have in the scientific community, that on the one hand, we rely on observational data to kind of make public health recommendations, but when you actually test that hypothesis in a randomized control trial, it doesn't hold true. So this is a dirty little secret, if you will, in the nutrition scientific community, that the randomized control trials do not generally support what is generally hypothesized on the basis of the observational cohort epidemiological studies.
Wow. Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Dale, when you think about this consensus report and what might be the most important things for people to know about consuming or not consuming staple grains, whole grains, enriched grains, indulgent grains, and also what's important for health professionals to know about how to talk to people about this?
Melissa, I have sort of an overarching wish for how we talk about food in this country. And that would be to take out a lot of the pejorative comments that we make, the polarization, these are good foods, these are bad foods. I think we've applied that in a lot of different categories. I mean, we apply it to good fats, bad fats, and then it turns out that, really there's more nuance to the different kinds of fats that one might eat. And when you look, and I just want to underscore what Glenn said in terms of really looking at the research instead of just sort of skimming the surface with this is good and bad. I mean, I think it happens in fruits and vegetables. So, fresh fruits are good, and if they come out of a can, they're not good. I mean, we have all sorts of views of food, and when it comes to grains, we really have said whole grains are good and the other refined grains of all sorts aren't good. And I think we just need to look at it in a more not only scientific way and do some further investigation of that, but just stop talking about it in those sorts of terminologies, that there are benefits to eating whole grains, and very few grains are eaten actually whole. As Glenn noticed, very few people go out into the field and, get some wheat berries. Mm-hmm. But there are reasons to have whole grains. There are certainly reasons to have refined grains and enriched and fortified grains. And, I actually think it's perfectly okay to have some of those indulgent grains as well. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about it in terms of how we can create and find a balance that provides the most nutrients for the calories that we're consuming. I think overall, getting away from the polarized pejorative view that we have about foods could really be helpful basically in any food group, but it certainly applies to the discussion that we've been having about grains.
Yeah, I agree completely. I always try to take a step back and say, are you getting nutrient-rich food choices most of the time? Mm-hmm. I actually like the make every bite count because, making every bite count, it could be a whole grain. It could be a refined grain. It could be that indulgent grain that you're just enjoying and savoring. Is there anything else either one of you want to share as we wrap up? I've got some resources that I want to point people to, but would love to hear any closing comments from either one of you.
I would like to just say something about that make every bite count. I don't know that every bite has to count. About 20 years ago, I remember I had a conversation with a nutritionist, I think Dale knows her, Karen Kratina. And Karen was saying that, you can get basically all the nutrients you actually need from a fairly small percentage of your daily calorie intake. So if you're consuming 2,000 calories a day, I don't know how many bites that would be, but I don't know that every bite has to have some nutritional value to it. So again, to echo what Dale had said, I don't know that we need to demonize all these bad foods, and occasionally indulgent foods are good to consume. And I don't know that it's kind of a healthy, honest way to do this, to say that, some foods are absolutely taboo, never have them because they're going to lead to inevitable harm to your body. Mm. So certainly a lot of your bites should count, but I'm not sure that all of them absolutely have to. But I know it's well-intentioned.
Yeah. Well, as is much of the oversimplified public health messaging that we hear, which is, one of my pet peeves. Mm-hmm. But that's why I'm interpreting it as make every bite count, even if it's just because you like it and you're enjoying it. So that's what the guilt-free RD would say, because food should not make you feel bad.
I can remember about 10 or 12 years ago, I was hiking up in the high Sierras with my son. We were doing this 200-mile backpacking trip on the John Muir Trail. And all we could think about the last half of the trip was this cafe that we knew was at the end. And as soon as we got off the trail, we immediately went in, ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. And it was the best 1,500 calories I've ever had in my entire life. I wasn't thinking about any nutritional value whatsoever. It was just an absolutely glorious meal.
You were getting some iron and protein and potassium. So.
Yeah. I could not agree more with Glenn and with his approach to thinking about food and to enjoying food. I think there's another important point here that, the dietary guidelines for Americans are supposed to guide people's eating. And I think when we have either statements that are not clear or confusing to the average customer or are just not realistic, that the dietary guidelines aren't guiding anything. Mm. The communities who care discuss them and, get down in the weeds and the chaff and have all these discussions. But if they're really meant for guiding how Americans eat, then I think we really need to be much more intentional and careful about the messaging. And although I don't think every bite has to count as a nutrient, I think that was a step in the right direction in terms of having people be more mindful and more present about their food instead of just saying, that's good, that's bad. And I'm guessing that, Glenn doesn't eat Coke and French fries and cheeseburgers every day. And again, sort of thinking about this as a balanced view of, and one of the things I've always appreciated about Glenn's view on these things is a balance between not only different kinds of foods, but a balance between food and physical activity.
Absolutely. Agree with both of you 150%. Well, thank you so much. As we're wrapping up, like I said, I have some resources. There's an infographic about grain facts. There's a really cool recipe that I want to share. It's a refried bean breakfast flatbread wrap. It uses canned, non-fat refried beans, scrambled eggs, tomato, and avocado. But there's a lot of swaps and substitutes that you can make. So I'll have that recipe linked in my show notes. You can follow the Grain Foods Foundation on their website, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I'll have all of those links as well. And of course, you can go to grainfacts.com, but come to my show notes at soundbitesrd.com as well. So thanks again, Dr. Gazer and Dale. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. It's been great to be here.
And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and enjoy those refined grains. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.